Dobro jutro, dobrodošli prije zvaničnog početka konferencije.
Good morning and welcome. Before we have the official start of the conference and while we're gathering in this online space, I would kindly ask our participant to locate the globe that in fact signalizes interpretation, where you can select the language you need for today's conference.
Kao što vidite, broj prijavljenih polako raste.
As you see, we have a growing number of participants, and our experience on Zoom so far have shown that 20 to 25% of participants join in the very last minute, and they need a few minutes to fully establish their connection. Therefore, I would like to ask you for just a few minutes of patience. It will not be 15, but up to 5 minutes. I think we can grant to those people who are connecting right now. We can use this time to select the language, and we can arrange everything else in technical terms that we need.
Nadam se da vidite slajd sa instrukcijama.
I hope you can see the slide with the instructions. The instructions are in English, but I believe that with the assistance of the icons and little images, we will be able to select the language. In case you have any problems in the selection of your respective language, or you do not see the globe, that unfortunately means that you will have to update the Zoom application installed on your laptops or computers. However, as we all have experiences, I think that it will be fine. Greetings back to Novi Sad and Nikšić. We have participants who are greeting us in chat.
Ajde da vidim, čekaj. Rodna mapa, gdje mi je rodna mapa? Sad ovako, prva početna stranica je, samo da nađem šta je prva početna.
Evo samo ću zamoliti sve da se do našeg početka zvaničnog za nekih par minuta, da provjerimo jesmo li na mute-u.
I would just like everyone to turn off their mics, so go mute, please. There is a small icon in the left bottom. So please do that. Yes, and I understand that we are, most of us, at homes, and we can hear some background noise, but we really have many participants today, and therefore, if you are not speaking, the suggestion is you turn your mic off. This is a very important conference, and this online space and the fact that we visit each other's homes also requires flexibility to certain obstacles such as background noise. We've also seen state officials speaking on CNN with children running around, and I'm sure that we all will show tolerance to such situations. Our technical support is sharing the slides all the time, and I'm convinced that you've already managed to select your respective language. I have to repeat, unless you have done that, please, or if you have any problems, please contact us in chat in any language. If you have any problems with language selection or you need any other technical support, please let us know through this chat function so we can make sure that you have a smooth connection to the conference. Our admins say that you can directly contact our admins in chat, so you can send a direct message or you can send a message to everyone.
Ovo su bile neke male tehničke informacije I uvod.
So these were some technical information in the introduction. I've already said that we will have the 5-minute flexibility to allow everyone in and to also find our way around the settings. Now I would ask our colleagues to prepare. Do we have anyone in the waiting room? Let's check that. If not, we are checking whether there is anyone in the waiting room. If not, it is a pleasure to welcome you to our regional online conference, Access to Justice for Women Victims of Survivors of Violence in the Western Balkans and Turkey in times of COVID-19. We hope that we find you in good health, despite the fact that we are exposed to enormous pressure from all sides. But we will hear from Meliha Sendic about that. She's the president of the Center for Women's Rights. Meliha, I give you the floor. Thank you, Emina. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Center for Women's Rights and the large team that organized this regional conference. Dear participants of the conference, dear guests, it is a real honor to have this opportunity to host you in this online world. We have 93 participants right now in this conference, and it is a great pleasure that we have this opportunity to discuss about everything that we've been working on together over the last 2 years. First of all, I would like to thank the UN Women and the EU for recognizing the problems that women face even before the pandemics, and for working together with us to make the best possible plan to address this problem in the times of the crisis and in the spirit of Agenda 2030. We have a plan not to neglect a single woman or girl who is facing violence or is at risk of violence. When we planned this conference in the end of last year, there were two options to organize it in terms of the venue, Istanbul and Sarajevo. But as we all know, Corona prevented us from doing so. But it did not make us give up on this conference. We are activists and our donors do understand the issues that we are facing. This conference has been organized by a team of people who have, most of them, survived Corona. So starting from us in the Center of Women's Rights, me too. then our expert associates, our partners, and our translation team as well. So even in such circumstances, we've managed to bring us all together in this online world, and this way of communicating is functioning, and hopefully we will see the results of a fruitful work today. In sending the invitations for the conference, we've once again seen how COVID affected our lives and us personally. Many people could not join because of COVID, or are overburdened with work because in their respective organizations, institutions, they're understaffed due to COVID. However, the number of participants that we see following the conference today shows us that they did find a way to join us. So I would like to say thank you to all of you for showing up in such a great number and showing us that you care and showing us that you want to continue working on improving the process of access to justice for women, victims and survivors of violence in Western Balkans and Turkey. And that this process is not stopped by COVID-19. Over the 2 years we worked together, you've given your maximum contribution, and I would like to thank you once again for that. This year, during the seminars, we had an opportunity to really go in depth into the problems and challenges that you've faced and still face, and you've never given up. So I am proud and I am happy to see you and hear you today. And despite the fact that we are not having this conference in Istanbul or Sarajevo, this conference, in fact, is taking place over the entire region of Western Balkans and Turkey, and in over 20 cities and towns that you are connecting from. I wish you great exchange today, and I wish us all to adopt some excellent ideas for a common working constructive cooperation in the region in the times to come. Once again, thank you. Meliha? Thank you for your address. Really, we've seen a period full of challenges, and we will have an opportunity after the introductory remarks and today over the program to exchange the experiences that you've mentioned. It is a special pleasure that we have the presence of the Head of Civil Society and Social Inclusion from Directorate General for Neighborhood and Enlargement Negotiations, Western Balkans, European Commission, Liselott Isaksson.
Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So as we're marking the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, I'm really, really pleased to participate today at this conference. Gender equality and women and girls empowerment, it is a core priority for the EU, and including in our external policies. And ensuring freedom from all forms of violence is a core thematic priority for us. So COVID-19, as the chair was saying, has really painfully unveiled the existing shortcomings that we have in the protection systems for survivors of violence against women across the world, and including in the Western Balkans and Turkey. And I wanted to join the previous speaker to really congratulate all those that have been working so hard during this crisis to try and counter these horrible negative effects that we're seeing on violence against women and domestic violence. We are trying to do our part from the side of the EU to channel more resources to this really important work in the region. But back to the conference, it's clear that we have to further deepen cooperation between governmental and non-governmental actors in this area. We need to build capacities, we need to build skills, and we need to bring together all stakeholders that are involved in the protection chain of victims and survivors of violence. And there has been a lot of progress, but there are really significant gaps and limitations left in the protection systems, even though all IPA beneficiaries have made a lot of efforts and reached a certain level to improve the status of women and to promote gender equality, more broadly speaking. I want to underline the importance of civil society organizations as well, and because they've been the main drivers for the development of national gender policies. They're the watchdogs, they play a crucial role in fighting what we can now see more negative trends of backsliding and sidelining of gender issues. And they are key players in insisting on justice and reparations and services for women who have suffered violence. So this conference is really a unique space for the exchange of these experiences, to verify good practices and also identify obstacles. And I hope that it will allow to learn from the best approaches to find ways to overcome these obstacles. The work that you're doing today and every day, it's fully in line with the EC investment on ending gender-based discriminations and violence, and also, of course, ultimately within the reforms, the justice reforms and the rule of law. So just 2 days ago, on the 24th of November, the EU adopted its new gender action plan, the third one, which will cover the period 21 to 25. And you probably know this, but the GAP provides a common policy framework for the EU and the EU member states to work together as a Team Europe to accelerate progress on gender equality and women's empowerment. And among the thematic areas, we're having ensuring freedom from all forms of violence. And one of the expected outcomes of the GAP 3, the Gender Action Plan 3, is that women and girls in all their diversity have improved access to justice to safeguard their civil and political rights. And in particular, ensuring that survivors of gender-based violence can access justice. And here, the actions that we're hoping to see is that we want to see this access to justice being reached by creating an enabling environment for women's access to justice, reforming legal norms that discriminate against women, and also creating effective and gender responsive justice institutions and reforming institutions, providing capacity building and empowering women directly, to informing them about their rights so that they can claim and exercise these rights. And I think that this conference of today is spot on in taking these really important issues forward. So I really wish you a very good 2 days of meeting. And I'm always very impressed by the way the technology nevertheless allows us to come together, to even do interpretation and to listen to each other despite these major challenges that COVID is placing on us. So thank you very much. Thank you again for really persisting in this work that you're doing that's so important. And I wish you all a very good conference.
Jako smo sretni da smo imali priliku da nas počastite svojim prisustvom.
We are very happy that we had the honor of your presence. Thank you for your encouraging remarks. This definitely today is a reflection of our joint effort. Our next speaker is the UN Women Deputy Regional Director for Europe and Central Asia, Blerta Cella.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Can you hear me? Thank you so much for the opportunity, dear partners, dear colleagues, dear friends, to be part of this important regional conference, Access to Justice for Women Victims and Survivors of Violence in the Western Balkans and Turkey during this time of COVID-19 pandemic. With the world in lockdown against COVID-19, we all know that the shadow pandemic of violence against women and girls has also broken out. As the violence hides behind the closed doors of lockdowns, we've seen all kinds of violence against women, and in particular domestic violence, on the rise. We've seen calls to helpline increasing up to 5-fold across the world based on research that we have been carrying out. We've also seen the rule of law institutions suffering many delays. We all know and agree that justice delayed is justice denied. And we know that the rule of law and access to justice remains the foundation through which women are able to uphold their rights, are able to seek redress for grievances and protect those who are most at risk of being left behind. We've also seen and know that the CEDAW committee has emphasized that states should consult with women's groups and civil society organizations to develop legislations, policies, programs in the criminal justice system to ensure that states, they create an enabling environment, a supportive environment that encourage women to claim their rights, to report crimes against them, to actively participate in criminal justice processes, and to take measures to prevent the retaliation against women seeking recourse to justice. We're very privileged to partner with the Center of Women's Rights that has proved to be an incredible partner in the challenge, in the joint challenge of putting together forward recommendations on women's access to justice and protection in the region, bringing all the parties in this protection justice chain together. We've been privileged to start to look together into the 14 real cases, 2 in each country that is involved in our program, which is supported with so much generosity by the European Union, implementing norms and changing minds in Western Balkans and Turkey. And based on each case study, concrete recommendations have emerged and developed and collected with all of you. So it is our wish that during this conference, we very much focus on how do we implement collectively these recommendations? How can we foster dialogue amongst the key partners, the stakeholders from the region, so that we together can promote, protect, respect, and uphold women's human rights. We can improve prevention, protection, and prosecution. The event is very timely because it is happening during the special days of the 16 days of activism on violence against women. And yesterday, we celebrated the International Day for Violence Against Women. The theme of this campaign is Orange the World: fund, respond, prevent, collect. And we know, as I said, that globally the response, including on COVID pandemic, has largely not taken sufficiently the needs and the concerns and the priorities of women and girls. Dear partners, the COVID-19 has exposed very concretely the threats, the inequalities, and the fractions that exist in our society long before the pandemic. But it has also opened the door for a lot of opportunities, for change, for us to work together to change ending violence against women and girls, to promote collectively access to justice for women and girls. This remains the most pervasive, unjust inequality and human rights violations. So it is now the time for us to look together to really bring these recommendations into practice. And I really want to congratulate all of you for being involved in the development of these recommendations. The 16 days of the and today's conference is a chance for us to work collectively, to accelerate our steps so that together we can ensure justice for women and girls. Thank you again. It's a privilege on behalf of UN Women to be part of this program, to be part of this conference and work with all of you to ensuring justice for women and girls and for societies. Thank you.
Hvala vam najljepša na vašem obraćanju. Očigledno ni zasićeno Zoomom nas nije...
Thank you very much for this speech. Obviously, not even the Zoom prevented us from sharing this topic, which we are very passionate about and that we worked on so strongly in the previous period. We managed to somehow increase our patience in our work and to try to transfer positive information and emotion. We will now move to the official part of our agenda. We have finished the opening remarks. I will just ask for those of you who have problems with the sound or connection, please let us know via chat box. Our interpreters are also reading it, and we will try to provide you with adequate support. We will now continue. Our Associate Professor Janana Radovčić will give us a good overview of the system of protection for victims and survivors of violence in the Western Balkans and Turkey, how the the system functioned and didn't function, and also the conclusions of the regional study, Is Justice Failing Women Survivors of Violence? During her presentation, you will have the chance to see 6 videos which will follow certain segments of her presentation. It's from the documentary series Justice for Women, based on real-life stories. Janana, please take the floor.
Hvala puno, Emina.
Thank you, Emina.
Srdačan pozdrav svima. Zamolit ću samo Adema da postavi, odnosno otvori PowerPoint prezentaciju koju sam poslala.
To share the power presentation that we sent.
S obzirom da Adem rukovodi prezentacijom, ja ću samo povremeno davati sugestiju da se pređe na naredni slajd. Dakle, još jednom pozdrav za sve. Čast mi je i zadovoljstvo što vam se mogu obratiti danas u okviru 16 dana aktivizma protiv rodno zasnovanog nasilja, odnosno nasilja nad ženama. I vjerujem da će svi naši današnji napori moći da se sublimiraju u kraći izraz pravo žena na život bez nasilja, jer to je ono o čemu smo, vjerujem, svi danas okupljeni u cyber prostoru zapravo i posvećeni. Moja prezentacija, kao što možete vidjeti iz naslova, jeste fokusirana na nefunkcionisanje sistema zaštite od nasilja nad ženama u zemljama Zapadnog Balkana i Turskoj. Dakle, neću govoriti o tome da li postoji nasilje i kolika je rasprostranjenost nasilja, s obzirom da smatram da prvenstveno činjenicu da postoji i da je rasprostranjeno nasilje nad ženama nije uopšte kontraverzna i upitna, ali će biti predmetom mog izlaganja zaključci do kojih smo došli u okviru opsežne regionalne analize, kakve mjere se poduzimaju za sprečavanje nasilja i kako sistem reaguje na nasilje koje se desilo. Tako da sam naslov prezentacije ne sugeriše da su sistemi apsolutno i u cijelosti nefunkcionalni. Ima aspekata sistema koji su funkcionalni, ali naš fokus i fokus naše analize je bio na onim segmentima koji ne funkcionišu ili uopšte ili ne funkcionišu na optimalnom nivou. Molim vas da prebacite na naredni slajd. Dakle, zaključci i preporuke koje ću danas izložiti se prvenstveno tiču reaktivnog odgovora sistema na nasilje nad ženama i temeljeni su na regionalnoj studiji pod naslovom Da li je pravda iznevjerila žene koje su preživjele nasilje, pripremljene u okviru zajedničkog projekta, dakle, Evropske unije i UN Women za zaustavljanje nasilja nad ženama u zemljama Zapadnog Balkana i Turskoj pod nazivom Implementacija normi promjena stavova. Možete prijeći na sljedeći slajd. Dakle, ovo su uvodni slajdovi informativne prirode, čisto da kontekstualiziramo u okviru čega je nastala regionalna analiza, kako biste shvatili zapravo njenu širinu i značaj. Hvala. Dakle, što se tiče regionalne perspektive, studije, ona se temelji na opsežnom komparativnom ispitivanju propusta i neuspjeha u pružanju prvenstveno institucionalnog odgovora na nasilje nad ženama u Albaniji, Bosni i Hercegovini, na Kosovu, Crnoj Gori, Sjevernoj Makedoniji, Srbiji i Turskoj, i analiza se posmatra iz perspektive stvarnih slučajeva, što je veoma značajno. Stvarni slučajevi koji su formalno procesuirani, odnosno prvenstveno formalno prijavljeni, potom formalno procesuirani unutar sistema, naravno pozicionirani u u sistem koji je dozvolio kompariranje sa međunarodnim standardima u ovoj oblasti, jer se u okviru studija slučaja zapravo analiziralo da li je i u kojoj mjeri sistem zapravo inkorporirao i dosljedno koristio, odnosno primjenjao međunarodne standarde iz ove oblasti, prvenstveno standarde sadržane u takozvanoj Istanbulskoj konvenciji, odnosno Konvenciji Vijeća Evrope za sprečavanje i borbu protiv nasilja nad ženama i nasilja u porodici. Fokus analize, samim tim i fokus zaključaka i preporuka jeste prvenstveno na reakciji sistema. Naravno da je za generalnu procjenu efikasnosti sistema također važno da se bavimo ispitivanjem koliko je uspješna prevencija, odnosno sprečavanje nasilja nad ženama, ali fokus u našoj regionalnoj studiji je bio na tome kako sistem reaguje onda kada do nasilja dođe. Iako vjerujem da ćete se složiti sa mnom kada kažem da je efikasan i kvalitetan sistem reakcije je zapravo najbolja prevencija nasilja nad ženama. Dakle, potpuna verzija regionalne studije je dostupna online, ali ja ću nastojati da u narednih 45 minuta koristeći videa i prezentirajući zaključke zapravo i pred vas iznesem najvažnije nalaze i najvažnije preporuke za naredni period u odnosu na sve uključene zemlje. Dakle, naglasila sam da ima segmenata sistema koji nisu naročito problematični i oni samim tim neće biti u fokusu izlaganja, ali želim samo da podsjetim sve na činjenicu da uspostavljanje adekvatnog i zadovoljavajućeg sistema nije jednokratna radnja, ne može se uraditi brzo, niti jednom kad se uspostavi formalno prihvatljiv i zadovoljavajući sistem, to ne znači da je posao završen. Sistem čine ljudi, a ne dehumanizirane apstraktne institucije i mislim da je to veoma važno da imamo u vidu, zato što različita mobilnost ljudi, odnosno profesionalaca u lancu zaštite, mijenjanje poslova, mijenjanje radnih pozicija i slično, samo naglašava značaj sistemskog, sveobuhvatnog pristupa u educiranju i senzibiliziranju profesionalaca. Možete imati savršen sistem i vidjet ćemo zapravo da ima značajnih segmenata koji su naprijeđeni u zemljama koji su uključene u analizu, međutim dijelimo brojne probleme koji su skoncentrisani u ovom drugom segmentu, a to je implementacija, odnosno primjenjivanje. U tom smislu će naravno biti formulisana i moja prezentacija. Možete, dakle, ova dva nivoa potencijalne disfunkcionalnosti su ovo što sam upravo sada rekla. S jedne strane formalno uspostavljen sistem, da li postoji, da li je potpun, a s druge strane kako konkretan sistem funkcioniše u praksi. Zapravo najveći broj problema leži u drugom segmentu koji se tiče adekvatne implementacije, odnosno stavljanja u funkciju formalno uspostavljenog sistema. Možete preći na naredni slajd. Hvala. Sama studija sadrži odvojene nacionalne izvještaje, međutim cilj nije bio da se sačini puka zbirka nacionalnih izvještaja, nego je korištena jedinstvena metodologija, unificirana je struktura izvještaja kako bi omogućila kasnije sadržajno kompariranje stanja u pojedinim zemljama i naravno izvođenje regionalnih zaključaka i preporuka sa prvenstvenim ciljem da izvedeni zaključci i preporuke služe za definisanje odgovarajućih mjera koje su provodive i koje su prvenstveno usmjerene na poboljšavanje odgovora sistema zaštite od nasilja nad ženama u svim zemljama koje su uključene u istraživanje. Relevantni međunarodni standardi su naravno korišteni kao referentni okvir i zbog toga možete preći na naredni slajd u kojem su izvedena zapravo 3 ključna aspekta ovog međunarodnih standarda prvenstveno sadržanih u Istanbulskoj konvenciji, a to je da adekvatno postavljen sistem treba prvenstveno da vrši funkciju podrške žena koje su preživjele nasilje nad ženama, treba ih također osnažiti u sudskim postupcima i dodala bih ovdje zapravo svim povezanim postupcima čije je pokretanje i provođenje uslovljeno konkretnim dijelom nasilja. To ne mora nužno biti samo krivični postupak, može se raditi o prekršajnim postupcima, može se raditi o građanskim sudskim postupcima kako su brakorazvodne parnice, odlučivanje o starateljstvu nad djecom, izdržavanje, postupci koji idu u tome da se utvrdi podijeli bračna stečevina zato što je došlo do razvrgnuća bračne zajednice zbog nasilja u porodici i sl. Tako da zapravo govorimo o velikoj množini potencijalnih postupaka u kojima je, pri tome u svim navedenim postupcima neophodno pružiti odgovarajuću podršku i zaštitu ženama. Između ostalog to počinje sa adekvatnim informiranjem žena o dostupnim mehanizmima, ali ne samo o tome koje opcije žene imaju, zato što formalno i sažeto predstavljanje opcija neće biti informativno za većinu žena kojima treba objasniti šta to faktički znači, na koji način zapravo funkcioniše sistem, šta žena može da očekuje, koliko je eventualno trajanje tih postupaka u mjeru naravno u kojoj se navedeno može uopšte procijeniti i slično, i kakav je potencijalni ishod samog postupka. To su sve informacije koje su veoma značajne za žene kako bi one donijele informisanu odluku da li će se uključiti u određene postupke i u kojoj mjeri će se aktivno uključiti u navedene postupke. Tako da, iako često govorimo i pozivamo žene da prijavljuju nasilje, moram reći da u jednom dijelu ne mogu kriviti žene koje ne prijavljuju nasilje. Apsolutno ne kažem da ne treba da prijavljuju, ali da bi se ne samo formalno, nego i suštinski stimulisale žene da prijave nasilje. Nije dovoljno da ih mi pozovemo, žene prijavite nasilje. Nije dovoljno zato što se radi o generalnom odnosu nepovjerenja, nesigurnosti i nedostatka adekvatne podrške za takve žene. Najmanje napora zapravo zahtjeva samo prijavljivanje nasilja. Prava borba uslijedi poslije i da bi se žene ohrabrile na taj inicijalni korak, čitav sistem treba da bude funkcionalan i da na taj način vrati, odnosno ponovno uspostavi povjerenje u rad svih uključenih institucija. Možete prići na sljedeći slajd. Regionalna analiza je bila moguća prvenstveno s obzirom na to da dijelimo dosta problema, dijelimo dosta kulturnih, društvenih normi. Adem, molim vas, pređite na sljedeći slajd. U smislu da je nasilje nad ženama ukorijenjeno u patrijarhalnim tradicijama, običajima koji su tipični za sva naša društva i zbog toga nije uopšte upitno reći da različiti oblici nasilja ne samo da opstaju, nego se i povećavaju. A povećavanje broja nasilja nije praćeno često sa povećanim brojem prijavljenih nasilja, tako da govorimo o značajnom procentu tamnih brojki koje nikad nisu formalno provedene kroz sistem iz različitih razloga, ali prvenstveno ovo što sam već rekla, što je vezano za generalno nepovjerenje u sistem i zbog čega naravno žene koje su žrtve nasilja i ne traže podršku iz različitih razloga, nekad zbog toga što formalno nije dostupna, drugi put zato što nije senzibilizirana u dovoljnoj mjeri, ali sve se u konačnici uglavnom može povezati sa nedostatkom također pristupa informacijama o njihovim pravima i mehanizmima zaštite. I ovdje bih iskoristila čisto jedan ilustrativni primjer, što često spominjem kad se govori...
Excuse me, Janana, I will have to interrupt you for a few seconds. Just a second. Can you just slow down a bit for the interpretation sake? And I would like to ask everyone, there were some problems with the English translation. Is everything okay now? I don't want anyone to
Nema
miss
problema.
any parts of your presentation. I apologize, Janana.
Mi ćemo sad nastaviti.
We will continue now. Okay.
Malo pogledati, negdje je to do Zoom,
I guess,
koje vi
yeah,
imate
this
instalirane, negdje evo mi ćemo
in some cases depend on the Zoom software that you have
U
installed.
redu.
We will also try to slow down a bit.
U redu, dakle mogu da nastavim.
Okay, I can continue.
U
Yes,
redu.
thank you very much.
Dakle, poenta je bila da
So
u
the
odnosu
point
na zajedničke
was
elemente
that
odabranih
when it comes
država
to
možemo
shared
zaključiti da
elements of the
institucionalni
selected countries, we
odgovori
can conclude
imaju,
that the
pokazuju
institutional
brojne probleme u
responses
procesuiranju
include
slučajeva
numerous
nasilja
problems
nad
in
ženama.
prosecution of cases of
Sve
violence
uključene
against
zemlje
women.
su u određenom
All
segmentu poboljšale
included
položaj
countries
žena i to je
have
između
improved
ostalog i
women's
rezultat
position to a
kontinuiranih
certain
napora
extent.
koji civilni
This
sektor
results
ulaže u
from
tom pravcu,
continuous
ali s druge
efforts of the
strane
civil
i s
society in
obzirom na
that direction,
preuzimanje različitih
and also
političkih
considering
obaveza
the
uslijed
various
kojih
political
je
obligations that
većina
have been
zemalja
assumed,
pristupila relevantnim
and
međunarodnim
that
konvencijama,
the
te
majority
je
of
na
these
taj
countries
način i
joined
došlo do
relevant
formalnog
conventions.
promovisanja rodne
Gender
ravnopravnosti,
equality
usvajanja
has been
specifičnog
formally
zakonodavstva
promoted by
za
adopting
zaštitu
the
od
specific
različitih oblika
legislation
rodno
for the
zasnovanog
protection
nasilja.
against
Tako da
various
kada je
forms of
riječ o
gender-based violence.
zakonodavstvu i
So when it
politikama,
comes to legislation
situacija
and policies,
je
the
uglavnom makar formalno
situation is,
posmatrano
at least when we
podignuta na
view it
jedan viši
formally,
nivo,
it's been
ali situacija na
elevated to a higher
terenu,
level.
faktička situacija
However,
nije,
the
ne
factual
prati ove
situation
formalne
on the
promjene i
ground
pokazuje
doesn't
zapravo da
follow
se
these
sistem i dalje
formal
suočava sa
needs, these
brojnim
formal
izazovima
changes,
u
and
pogledu
we can
implementacije
see that the
zakona,
system
u
still
pogledu
faces many challenges in the
jačanja
implementation of
zakonodavnih
the
i
legislation,
institucionalnih okvira, a sve s ciljem
strengthening of
pružanja efikasne
legislative and
zaštite.
institutional frameworks for the provision of efficient
Osim
protection.
toga, u svim posmatranim
In
zemljama
addition,
postoji
in all
određen
the
stepen poštivanja
involved
relevantnih
countries,
međunarodnih
we've seen a
standarda koji
certain
su,
level
kao
of
što
respect
rekoh,
for international
čisto
standards
izraz
that
političkih
are often a
pritisaka i
reflection or an
preuzimanja
expression
političkih
of
obaveza.
political pressures
Sad
and
neko može
political
reći to nije
commitments which have been taken
problematično,
over. So
bitno je
some
da
people can
usvojimo
say that
relevantno
might
zakonodavstvo u
not be problematic.
konačnici,
It's important
međutim
that
nije
we
svejedno
adopt
da
the
li
relevant
pristupate
legislation
određenim
ultimately.
instrumentima
However, it is
zato
not
što
the
od
same
vas to
approach
neko
if you
zahtjeva, pa je
access
to
certain
samo još jedna
instruments
obaveza koju trebate
because it is
štrihirati,
being requested and
ili
you
se
see it as
radi
an
zaista
obligation
o
and a
promjeni
checklist,
svijesti
or we
i
are talking about a
senzibilizaciji
true
kreatora
change of
politika i
awareness and
donosioca zakona u pojedinim
sensitivity
zemljama.
of policy
Iako
creators and
formalno
legislators
posmatrano
in
rezultat
certain
će biti
countries.
isti, da imamo
Formally speaking, the
usvojeno
result will be the same.
zakonodavstvo,
We will
odnosno
have
usvojene javne
legislation
politike.
adopted, or public policy
Razlika
adopted.
između te dvije
The
situacije se zapravo
difference
pokazuje u
between
ovom
the two
drugom
processes
segmentu, a
that
to je
lead to it
faza
is
implementacije
relevant
i
and
primjenjivanja
important because
navedenih
that will be
međunarodnih
seen in the
standarda.
implementation and application of the
Što se
international
tiče samih
standards.
međunarodnih standarda, iako su manje više
When it comes to
zajednički za
international
sve
standards,
posmatrane
they
zemlje,
are more or
u
less
analizi smo
common in
morali
all
uvažiti
the
da
overviewed countries,
nisu
but
sve
in the
posmatrane
analysis
zemlje
we had to take into
pristupile
account that not
relevantnim
all the
međunarodnim
countries have
dokumentima u isto vrijeme,
signed the
što se
relevant
naravno
international documents at the
odražava
same
i na
time,
nivo
which is of
potpunosti
course
pravnih,
reflected at the level
institucionalnih i
of
proceduralnih okvira za
completeness
zaštitu
of the legal
žena žrtava
and
nasilja, ali je svejedno
institutional
poslužilo kao dobra osnova
frameworks
za
for protection
poređenje
of women.
sistema navedenih
But
zemalja i
it is a good
izvlačenje
basis for the
regionalnih
comparison of
zaključaka sa
the
regionalnim
countries and
preporukama.
for
Tako
the
da
regional recommendations and conclusions. I'm sorry, I am interrupting you again. I think it's excellent given the number of participants. I am getting messages about the languages. Could you please
meni govorite, je li, ili je tu sad svima?
Could you please, Janana, check
Meni je
if
off.
you have selected a language? Okay,
Imam
you
samo
are,
off i engleski, to su dvije opcije koje imam.
you are on off. Do you have a
imam off i
Bosnian
engleski.
channel? No, I only have off and English. Okay, then please continue. I am waiting for IT to give me a message. So if I am on off, could we please have a
Nema problema, nemojte
1-minute
se
break
izvinjavati, samo da
for
riješimo
the
problem, i meni je
admins
tu
to
interes kao i
resolve this
svima
problem?
vama.
Of course, it is in my interest as it is in yours to resolve the technical problem.
Mogu li samo zamoliti u međuvremenu svi koji su imali problem sa prevodom, jesu li se svi javili u chat?
Please, if you had any trouble with interpretation, please let us know in chat. I hope that all people who've had trouble with interpretation have already written in chat.
Ja predlažem da se ne udaljavamo mi puno od svojih laptopa, ali evo da uzmemo ove 2 minute pauzice, samo da ovo pokušamo riješiti.
Please stay close to your laptops, but let us take 2 minutes to try to resolve this. Let's say 3 or 4 minutes. Would that be okay for everyone to try to resolve this?
Ako želite, rješenje može biti da ja nastavim izlagati na engleskom jeziku, time ćemo riješiti ovaj problem.
Džana, to bi bilo izvrsno ukoliko to vama...
Maybe I can continue in English if that's better. Yes, that might be better. I'm sorry, I'm stopping the presentation.
Samo da vidim gdje sam stala. Okay, so I'll continue in English due to some technical issues. I hope that's okay with everyone. Okay, just to see where I stopped. I'm sorry. So, as I was saying, the common elements that enable the regional analysis were, among others, the shared and mutual acceptance of relevant international standards in this regard, with special focus, of course, on Istanbul Convention. So the relevant international standards actually enabled us to compare the different legislative solutions, public policies, and concrete measures, protocols, and established institutions in the chain of protection from violence against women. Ademe, možete prebaciti na sljedeći slajd. Thank you. Okay, so the main conclusion regarding the legislative framework is the lack of adequate definition of violence against women. So there is a trend of criminalization, different forms of violence against women, but it varies significantly across the region. Although most countries do have separate laws on domestic violence, this doesn't necessarily indicate the criminalization of such acts. Therefore, we have situation where violence against women is being observed or being criminalized as a criminal offense, but in some countries it's just misdemeanor, therefore influencing the same level of protection for victims of such forms of violence. So the laws in the region continue to operate with the concept of, for example, domestic violence, but it's considerably narrower and doesn't necessarily refer to women as envisaged by Article 3 of the Istanbul Convention. So we do have a lot of situations where violence against women, I'm focusing on violence against women because the definition of that type of violence against women is actually the most problematic in accumulation with the definition of rape and sexualized violence against women. So we have a situation where different cases of domestic violence isn't treated as criminal offense, but marital dispute. Therefore, no criminal proceedings were initiated in a number of cases, and actually it's a common practice in certain municipalities or certain regions, sometimes even countries. And marital partners are actually they're led towards the different civil procedures in order to recuperate and in order to establish good relationships in their marriage, totally ignoring the criminal aspect of domestic violence. So we observed a lot of problems. Sometimes when the domestic violence is not perceived formally as a separate criminal offense, the fact that the violence was committed within domestic relationship is being observed as aggravated circumstance. So we do have that kind of practice. It's not criminal offense, but if we have modus to incriminate that kind of act, not formally calling it domestic violence, we can use the fact that it was committed in domestic relationship as an aggravated circumstance. More effort, this shows, of course, that more effort is needed in further alignment of national legislation with Istanbul Convention in all countries concerned. Some other problematic aspects were the lack of criminalization of stalking, of forced marriage, rape committed in marriage, etc. It's not the level of alignment with the Istanbul Conventions and definitions contained within Istanbul Convention is not aligned, and it's not consistent throughout the region. So for legislators among all these selected countries, a message that the job and the efforts needed to improve legislative framework and framework of public policies is not finished. We have still a lot of tasks to do in that regard, and we still have a lot of space for improvement of legislative framework. I would just like to emphasize the one particularly disturbing and worrying trend, and actually the lack of proper definition of rape. That is something we observed throughout the region. The problem with the rape in regards to definition, of course, is that it doesn't necessarily describe it as any sexual act involving without consent, which should be incorporated in definition of rape. Due to highly problematic aspects of proving whether there was a threat or there was a use of force on women in order to force her to have sexual act. Actually, a lot of definitions do operate with the concept of threat or the concept of used force, but you have we actually encountered with different cases where it wasn't obvious for the judges or any professionals involved in the particular cases that there has been a use of force. Sometimes there won't be visible force that's been used in order to make someone participate in different involuntarily sexual acts. Therefore, we think it's very important to focus, to move focus and shift it from threats and from the usage of force to lack of, I would say, explicit consent. There is a lot of voices in the region and in the world in that manner to include that that condition for in the definition of rape, any sexual act without consent, but I would add without explicit consent, because as we have problems with proving threats or violence that's been used in regards to rape, there has also been different practice of perceiving consent of the victim. What does consent mean? We analyze cases where moaning of the victim was being interpreted as a consent, although she was making those moans because of the fear, because of the pain, etc. But nevertheless, it didn't stop judges from interpreting moans and behavior of victim as implicit consent. Therefore, I think we need to step up further and include explicit consent in the definition of rape. Okay, I would like to pass on the next slide, Ademe, molim vas. Ademe, čujemo li se, molim vas, prebacite na naredni slajd. One thing I should have mentioned also in regards to the previous slide is that since domestic violence isn't consistently perceived as a serious and damaging criminal offense, the focus of systems reaction is on protective measures. And that's also part of a very important part of analysis. Now, we don't say that protective measures shouldn't be issued or shouldn't be introduced in the formal system of protection. What we found out during this regional study was that sometimes it seems like professionals observe and perceive protective measures as totally separate system of protection or reaction that doesn't need to be cumulated with criminal responsibility for the offense. What we're trying to say throughout the study and the series of roundtables we held in all concerned countries is there should be accumulation. So we insist on issuing protective measures in order for them to achieve their goal to provide immediate, urgent protection for victims of violence against women. But on the other hand, it doesn't exclude the need for adequate and timely response of criminal justice system in that regard. So I would just like to point on that worrying trend in the region. Okay, so you can, možete se prebaciti na naredni slajd. Now I would like to show a video from Turkey, one case from Turkey, and it's called Video Turkey #1. Ademe, molim vas samo da počnete sa prikazivanjem videa. Hvala.
During their marriage, Mr. Mert physically and psychologically abused Mrs. Yağmur and her children. Mr. Mert even tried to burn her to death. She reported him to the police several times. Mrs. Yağmur left her husband and went to court to file for divorce. She received a protection order against him. Months later, Mr. Mert stabbed her to death in front of their children. How did this happen? How did the system fail Mrs. Yağmur and her children? Because Turkey has yet to specifically criminalize domestic violence against women, as outlined in the Istanbul Convention. Because Mrs. Yağmur and her children were forced to leave their home, not the alleged perpetrator. Because the Mrs. Yağmur was not told she could receive financial support or seek accommodation. Because perpetrators do not face serious consequences when they violate protection orders. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Align Turkish criminal legislation with the requirements of the Istanbul Convention. Make shelters accessible and available for all survivors of violence, as well as for their children. Appoint gender-sensitive and experienced female staff in law enforcement agencies. Require regular training within police units on legal arrangements regarding violence against women, sanctioning professionals who do not enforce the law. Violence against women is the symptom, not the virus. The virus is gender inequality. No cure will come as long as ineffective prevention, protection, and prosecution remain.
Hvala. Možete nas vratiti na prezentaciju i naredni slajd.
Presentation, next slide, please.
Okay, so I basically said everything that we deem important in this regard, but I would like also to emphasize the need for legislators throughout the region to consistently and adequately criminalize all different acts of violence against women, which prove to be particularly challenging, such as stalking, marital rape, and different threats, what we like to call, not like to call, it's called generally cyber violence against women. So that includes different types of threats committed via different technologies, social networks, cell phones, computers, etc. We did observe the lack of proper incrimination of these types of violence against women. Once we spoke with professionals from different countries, they said there is sometimes a certain way to criminalize acts of cyber violence against women, but it depends basically whether the professional in charge will recognize the gender aspect of cyber violence and whether it will interpret the legal norm wide and extensive enough in order to include different types of cyber violence against women. We could actually make this much easier for the professionals while implementing those norms if we would explicitly introduce provisions and criminalize different types of violence against women that's on the rise in the last few decades particularly. So the theft of profiles on social networks, different threats for victims that the perpetrator will make public different videos and the pictures with sensitive information, etc., is something we think it's particularly disturbing and worrying and needs to be addressed properly in the legislative pieces in the countries that were included in this analysis. Also, I would like to point the necessity for everyone involved to support the need to formally change the definition of rape, but also to insist on proper sensibilization of professionals dealing particularly with cases of sexualized violence against women. We can move to the next video and next slide. Ademe, molim vas, naredni slajd I video. Hvala.
I will just say a brief guide. The translation interpretation of videos will not be provided in further presentation because each country and all of you will receive after this conference videos on your local languages. So please enjoy the videos in English language, and we will share it after the conference.
The first time Andrei was physically violent towards his wife, Maria, was during her pregnancy. For the rest of their 4-year marriage, He constantly abused her. After she took their child and left, he threatened to hurt her and kidnap the child. Maria reported him to the police multiple times, filed several requests for protection orders, and started divorce proceedings. Despite significant video and text evidence of the abuse, Andrei's visitation rights were never revoked. The stalking and threats continued for years. How did this happen? How did the system fail Maria and her child? Because Maria was referred to mediation during the divorce procedure, despite her reports of domestic violence. Because the police only issued a verbal warning after Andrei threatened to kidnap their child. Because the court failed to enforce protection orders when Andrei evaded court summons. Because the law sets extremely low punishments for domestic violence. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Harmonize national policies with the Istanbul Convention and the European Union Directive on Victims. Make it mandatory to work with perpetrators in the law on protection from domestic violence. Prohibit mediation by judges in domestic violence cases. Consistently apply the family law to revoke or limit the child visitation and custody rights of violent parents. Violence against women is the symptom, not the virus. The virus is gender inequality. No cure will come as long as ineffective prevention, protection, and prosecution remain.
Once again, I will join in just to check whether our speakers, Diana, are here, and Amina, can you hear us? Is everything all right?
Yes,
okay,
I can
great.
hear. I was just saying.
So, Jana,
that...
I'm giving the floor to you.
Okay, thank you. Ademe, u redu, hvala. To je to, time slide treba. What is also obvious from the regional analysis is that there are usually many institutions and institutional actors that are responsible for the protection of victims and survivors of violence against women. So that can be in some form of referral mechanisms for cases of domestic violence and other types of violence against women, but we did notice that coordination and proper effective communication between different institutional actors remains the biggest challenge. Coordination, particularly among the actors that are on different levels of government, is a significant challenge. So the lack of coordination and communication does affect the effectiveness of the system of protection, sometimes even with the tragic consequences as we have observed in analyzed cases. Even where there is concrete procedures for protecting the survivors, they're oftentimes not consistently implemented and followed in practice, sometimes due to lack of knowledge. But I would say that the biggest problem is the lack of awareness or mere negligence of the people involved in protection and in concrete cases. Sometimes the official and formal proceedings have been introduced, but they are not adapted to the specific needs of survivors who oftentimes need or require protection late at night or outside of working hours of many institutions responsible for the protection of survivors. Možemo na naredni slajd. As I have previously mentioned, observed cases and analysis throughout the region show a lot of problems with manipulation with family rights and responsibilities, particularly once we started analyzing the behavior and official steps taken by the professionals in the protection chain, especially in regards to completely ignoring the history and dynamics of violence. So it was observed that through behavior and acting of professionals, one can notice pretty easily the public policy regarding violence against women, and with specific focus on maintaining family intact. So the family is being observed as something holy, which shouldn't be dissolved in case of in one case of domestic violence or some other dispute. Therefore, the marital partners are usually being stimulated to use the services of mediation. On one hand, the problem can be within legislative framework. For example, we have that situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in one entity where mediation is obligatory if there are minor children in the marriage. In other countries, the mediation isn't obligatory, but de facto is being conducted because professionals are pointing marital partners towards the mediation, thus affecting, or should I say, decreasing the will and commitment of women to reporting the different acts of domestic violence. Also, it has been observed that intimate partner violence is being qualified differently. In some countries, there is no provision in the law enabling criminal prosecution of different types of intimate partner violence. In other countries, we observe the general lack of commitment of professionals in reporting or acting in accordance with their obligations according to the law. So there are a lot of cases where intimate partner violence has been observed as misdemeanor. And it was saddening but very interesting to see cases where perpetrator, the violent male partner, was actually charged for a misdemeanor because it affected the peace of community, misdemeanor against the peace in community, but he wasn't charged with anything because he disturbed the peace of his intimate partner or because he inflicted different kind of physical injuries on her body or exposed her to different types of psychological violence. So that was a very worrying trend, starting with improper criminalization of intimate partner violence, but also dealing with problematic qualification if there is no basis in the law for criminal prosecution of different types of intimate partner violence. Yes, okay, so we can move to next slide, Adme. And we can show video from one case from Albania. Možete prikazati video.
The 6 children of Mirella Kushta and Aryan Kushta from Albania witnessed their drunk father repeatedly abusing them and their mother. After the children called the police, all family members were immediately escorted to the police station. But Mrs. Kushta and her children refused to report Mr. Kushta for domestic violence or request a protection order. Mr. Kushta was detained for a few hours. 6 months later, he killed his wife. How did this happen? How did psychological violence and alcohol abuse, because the police did not continuously monitor the case, because the case was not reported to the referral mechanism to help survivors get support, because the survivors of violence under the threat did not report it, because the police, without a report, could not file a case. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Require mandatory training for police on assessing and managing risks. Amend the criminal code to criminalize psychological violence. Establishing emergency teams of field specialists to evaluate and manage risks. Ensure a better coordination and communication among institutions providing protection from violence. Violence against women is the symptom, not the virus. The virus is gender inequality. No cure will come as long as ineffective prevention, protection, and prosecution remain.
Hvala, Ademe. Možemo ići na sljedeći slajd. Hvala. Thank you. We could observe from this video and from the analyzed case that particular challenge for all professionals involved in protection and reaction to violence against women is psychological violence. It shows as problematic on the level of legislative criminalization, but also when demanding proper involvement of professionals. The biggest challenge is actually proving psychological violence, and that's being used as an excuse for not formally prosecuting cases where there has been, and I will just put quote marks, just psychological violence, because usually even the legal norm demands there has been accumulation of different types of violence, domestic violence, in particular, such as psychological and physical. But we have different types of economic violence, of verbal violence that actually leads to psychological violence, and professionals are actually coping with different challenges while trying to enable proving of psychological violence. The accent and the formal focus in criminal proceedings is on the protection of perpetrator in order to maintain his basic human rights and to maintain his innocence, unless it can be proven without reasonable doubt that he committed psychological violence. But if they are smart, and they usually are while committing those acts of psychological violence, victim is only able to share her experience with the professionals. Sometimes even the survivors of psychological violence are not aware that they have been a victim of psychological violence. Therefore, it's crucial to include different types of professionals with adequate educational background, with adequate experience in the field, in order to first enable victim to see that they've been the victim of psychological violence, but also to use the expert witness opinions to prove the psychological violence, because sometimes there won't be any injuries, and psychological violence is similarly to physical violence, deadly for women. It's in jeopardy. It's putting them under high risk regarding their health, their security, their involvement in the community, etc. So the psychological violence is a big challenge, and it's globally a challenge, not just for the region. But the first step would be to formally and explicitly criminalize psychological violence, and then through mandatory and continuous education to educate and sensibilize professionals to recognize different acts of psychological violence. And there is a variety of different types of psychological violence. Okay, so this was the illustration of difficulties while trying to prove psychological violence. I would call Adem to show us the video from Bosnia, video number 2.
afternoon, Alina returned home to find a stack of firewood outside her door, a gift from her former partner. When she lit a fire a few days later, the wood exploded. Her How did the system fail Alina? Because she was never informed that she could file for compensation from the perpetrator. Because lawyers were not knowledgeable about best practices for cases of violence against women. Because protective measures were not taken to stop the perpetrator from harassing Alina. Because the state does not offer integrated services, shielding victims from financial hardship. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Develop individual plans for protection and support for every woman survivor. Secure adequate and continuous financing for integrated services for victims at low or no cost. Require mandatory training on responding to violence against women for everyone in the system of protection. Amend laws to make quality, specialized support services and free legal aid available to all women survivors. Violence against women is the symptom, not the virus. The virus is gender inequality. No cure will come as long as ineffective prevention, protection, and prosecution remain.
Možemo naredni slajd. So cases analyzed within research showed that the initial reaction of responsible actors and professionals is usually inadequate. Many survivors interviewed in the course of the regional research have reported that they haven't been aware or were not made aware of their rights, as well as different options and proceedings that were available for them in regards to protection from violence. There's also a serious problem of inadequate, untimely, or sometimes even a non-existent risk assessment and the subsequent referral of the cases of violence against women to the relevant institutions. So as the examples from different countries suggest, various actors, including police, exercise discretion in deciding which cases to refer to the bodies responsible for the coordination of assistance to the survivors. Also, the law clearly envisages that all cases should be referred. So this type of subjective decision and discretionary right that certain professionals take is particularly damaging to the victims in high-risk situation. And the problem is, what do we perceive as high-risk situation? You have to be properly trained in order to be able to recognize the risk. It's not common knowledge. It's not something you see on the street and you get to make a decision whether it's a high risk or low risk situation. Professionals need to be educated and sensitized in order to adequately and timely recognize the different risks and dangers for women victims of violence. Monitoring of situations involving domestic violence is also a serious challenge. In this sense, it's it's particularly telling that out of that, for example, we had a lot of statistical data from Serbia also, and in 10 out of I think 26 or 27 cases of femicide, all relevant actors had information on previous violence. They had information, yet they didn't establish those cases as high-risk cases, and consequently didn't adapt their actions to adequately, timely protect the victims of violence. Patriarchal attitudes and bias are also evident in some reported cases where the police blame the victim and her condition that has actually been caused by prolonged psychological violence without recognizing or identifying the primary aggressor. We had different, very worrying statements from the victims where they said, where, for example, social workers qualified certain women as not as bad mothers because they initiated the proceedings for sharing the marital property, for establishing the alimony obligations towards the other partner, etc. And they actually said that to our activists that conducted the interviews. They said, if she is such a good mother, why is she dealing with property issues? Why is she not actually dealing and trying to protect her children in the case? So we have a lot of difficulties with observing the situation in which women are using their legal rights, yet they're not perceived as a good mother, good wife, citizen that needs protection. And of course, that reflects their formal actions within concrete cases. Also, it was noticed that different cases where a male perpetrator actually reported domestic violence as a response to women reporting domestic violence. And their intention was that professionals actually qualify that as different types of marital or extramarital disputes, depending whether they were in marriage or in cohabitation community. And actually, it's a strategy that usually works, and it's very worrying. So if I report my husband or my partner for violence, and he immediately reports also that I attacked him or I provoked him, etc., that I am a hysterical woman, which they usually say, police officers don't continue with their obligations as they should. They don't recognize the primary aggressor as they should recognize, and it usually ends up there, like misdemeanor. They've been, through their fights, they've been actually affecting their neighbors, but not each other, and that's where the story ends. So we urge professionals to recognize this troublesome strategy of male perpetrators in order to eradicate it through, particularly through behavior and acting in concrete cases. Just a second to see. Okay, regarding protection measures, they are rarely issued, and the monitoring of their application is rarely undertaken. Even when a legislator provides for protection measures, such as removal of a perpetrator from the family home, they are rarely implemented. It is worrying that often the protective measures are directed towards victim and children. So they are sometimes removed from the family home. The children are being removed from the family home, and the perpetrator stays in the home. But in different and separate situations where perpetrators are being removed from the home, they're rarely implemented. Physical protection and separation of survivors from the perpetrator is also problematic, especially in cities or villages where it's very difficult to maintain the distance between each other. Some cases also brought to our attention the absurd situation in which the immediate protection order expected to be implemented within the same household. So no one leaves the home, but yet they will be protected from each other, or women will be protected from perpetrator. Across the region, there is evident practice of violating emergency and protective orders. Emergency protective orders, but also long-term protection measures. And the perpetrators that do violate are not facing consequences at all, or are not facing adequate proportionate consequences for the violation of protection measures. We can move to next video from Kosovo. Ademe, molim vas, predstavite video, to jest aktivirajte video za Kosovo broj 1. Ja ne čujem.
Evo i učesnici se javljaju da ne mogu čuti.
As required by law, because when Fatima died, 3 weeks after she requested the order, it had still not been issued, because as affirmed by the Kosovo Constitutional Court, judicial institutions violated Fatima's right to life. Because the Center for Social Work did not enforce visitation rights for Fatima's parents to see their granddaughter. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Appoint more judges specialized in criminal proceedings related to domestic violence. Issue emergency protection orders within the time required by law. Take consistent, sufficient disciplinary action against professionals who fail to follow the law on domestic violence. Violence against women is the symptom, not the virus. The virus is gender inequality. No cure will come as long as ineffective prevention, protection, and prosecution remain. After 10 years together, Fatima filed to end her extramarital union with Basim. She took their daughter and went to live with her parents. After Basim began constantly threatening her, Fatima requested an emergency protection order. 3 weeks later, Basim killed Fatima in the center of Pristina. He has never been brought to justice, and his parents were given custody of the child. How did this happen? How did the system fail Fatima? Because the court did not issue the protection order within 24 hours as required by law. Because when Fatima died, 3 weeks after she requested the order, it had still not been issued. Because as affirmed by the Kosovo Constitutional Court, judicial institutions violated Fatima's right to life. Because the Center for Social Work did not enforce visitation rights for Fatima's parents to see their granddaughter. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Appoint more judges specialized in criminal proceedings related to domestic violence. Issue emergency protection orders within the time required by law. Take consistent, sufficient disciplinary action against professionals who fail to follow the law on domestic violence. Violence against women is the symptom, not the virus. The virus is gender inequality. No cure will come as long as ineffective prevention, protection, and prosecution remain.
Hvala, nastavljamo dalje. Možete prići na sljedeći slajd. Just one note, my presentation will be a couple of minutes longer than anticipated, but I will soon release you to a break. I'm sure you're all looking forward to it, but I do have a couple of interesting findings and conclusions to share with you. So many problems so far identified in the practice are in a large part due to the inadequate training of professionals in the relevant fields. This is obviously a problem, and it's been different types of cases that were analyzed actually serve as a proof for this statement. I already mentioned to you different types of statements made by the officials, including social workers, judges, prosecutors, police officers, etc. So this type of approaching the victim of violence against women and different cases of violence against women is in direct opposition to the generally advised approach in the field, according to which re-traumatization of the survivor through subsequent contacts with the perpetrator should also be avoided. Sometimes professionals will do exactly that. They will advise the victim to solve her problems with the perpetrator. They will be in the same room, in some way trying to make them confront each other, and through mediation of professionals resolve their issue. Further problem is that the general knowledge gap, but I would say more problem with sensitization and sensibilization of professionals is not adequately addressed. While we spoke with different professionals in different countries, they all said there is some kind of education, there is some kind of training. It's not the problem that there is a complete lack of trainings. The problem is that they're not mandatory for various professionals. They're not consistent, uniform, and they're not being conducted and organized in the long term. So whenever you have the change in personnel in different institutions, the fact that one professional was attending and was participant of different trainings and educations doesn't make any changes in the practice, because it can easily happen that he will be transferred to some other place, working place within institution, or actually outside of that particular institution. So mandatory trainings for all professionals are necessary in order to address this problem systematically. And the only way you can address this problem is systematically. There is no other way, at least not a successful other way. Another indication that domestic violence is not taken seriously by the relevant actors is the fact that resources are often inadequate, funds are insufficient for providing all services and ensuring all the rights of the survivors in practice. Counseling and psychological support for the survivors is not consistently and widely secured for the victims. Funding from the state for CSOs providing specialist services to survivors of violence against victims of violence against women is scarce, partial, rarely provided, and women CSOs are mainly being funded by foreign donors. Now, this raises serious concerns regarding the sustainability of such a funding model. free legal aid is also relatively problematic. First of all, it's not always available to all survivors due to different formal conditions and formal requirements. In some countries, only unemployed victims are entitled to free legal aid and services. This leaves even employed women with minimum salaries without legal support. In some other countries, the survivors are obliged to submit the confirmation that they have been reported the crime and that they have been identified as survivors of domestic violence, as is the case in Northern Macedonia, for example. So if you hadn't reported and you don't have proof that you are are in a status of victim of particular crime, then you are not eligible for different types of free legal aid and free legal services. In some other countries, access to free legal aid is being conditioned by income, where only income is actually measured, not the different obligations that women have towards children, not their purchasing power, etc. So different problems are actually evident in the system of providing free legal aid. Finally, the support for the survivors after the proceedings is also inadequate. Psychological, medical, legal support, as well as rehabilitation services are often insufficient. When it comes to enabling women to continue their lives and to recover from abusive relationships, survivors rarely do receive adequate economic support. So opportunities for their integration in the labor markets are limited due to general inequality and discrimination in labor relations. When we are talking about violence against women and the lack of effective response of the system to protect victims of the domestic violence and different types of violence against women, we can talk about discrimination of women, because ineffectivity and ineffective legal system, including a legislative and institutional part, is affecting women in much higher percentage. Therefore, any lack of a proper response of the system of protection is particularly dangerous and risky for women, because they are they make the majority of victims of gender-based violence. But also there is discrimination that the way we typically perceive it in different types of relations, such as the working relations and labor relations in general. So eradicating discrimination in different segments of society is crucial for women being able to approach those formally established services. We can now move to video. I think it's the last one, North Macedonia number 2. Ademe, molim vas da pustite video.
Jovana ended her 5-month relationship with Luka after he became violent with her. For the next 2 years, Luka continued to harass, threaten, and physically and psychologically abuse Jovana. Jovana reported this behavior to the police and Center for Social Work more than 20 times. But neither institution took any steps to prosecute Luka or protect Jovana. Legal action only began after Jovana took the case to a local organization that assists victims of domestic violence, who advocated on her behalf. How did this happen? How did the system fail Jovana? Because the police did not file an official report for any of the more than 20 incidents of violence that Jovana reported. Because neither the police nor the Center for Social Work issued any temporary protection measures. Because Jovana was not given any information about her rights, the legal procedures she could initiate, or the services available to her. Because once the charges were filed, the entire procedure lasted 7 months, which is far longer than the deadline set in the law. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Require mandatory training for police officers, social workers, and public prosecutors on their legal obligations in managing cases of domestic violence. Ensure that police reports are filed consistently and immediately in accordance with the law. Hold officials accountable who do not follow legal procedures and mismanage cases of domestic violence. Violence against women is the symptom, not the virus. The virus is gender inequality. No cure will come as long as ineffective prevention, protection, and prosecution remain.
Hvala, možete preći na naredni slajd. So I will finish my presentation in regards to findings of regional research with this slide. It will take me an additional 2 minutes, and I will present the most important recommendations in the beginning of the next session. So this slide basically tries to make informal connection with the problems that were perceived in regards to criminal prosecuting different types of violence against women. And what we observed is that there are common issues and common problems typical for all acts of gender-based violence, such as the lack of multisectoral coordinated response of the system, lack of sensibility, and sometimes improper education of relevant professionals, different problems regarding communication between institutions and professionals involved in the chain of protection, also the lack of proper and adequate victim-oriented approach, including the language used towards the victim, including formal and informal communication, adequate factual informing the victim on their rights, possibilities, and risks if they choose to use some of those legally available options. But on the other hand, we noticed we noticed the specific problems relating to some specific types of violence against women. And what actually was quite interesting but also worrying to see is that the domestic violence and femicide share problems that are typical for those acts. First of all, the problem is the lack of timely and adequate treatment of these cases and lack of adequate approach to victim. Now, when I'm talking about femicide, we usually do have in mind different situations where different types of domestic violence or intimate partners violence was actually reported, or there were some signs that there is violence in the certain cohabitation or certain type of family marriage, etc. Also, there was a lack of timely and adequate risk assessment. Usually the professionals, and I'm talking about primarily now prosecutors, have been qualifying these acts in milder forms. Milder forms, like basic form of certain acts, is actually the form that is also being punished more leniently. So sometimes the act is not even being qualified as criminal offense, but as misdemeanor, as marital dispute, as incident, public incident. In other cases, when it's being qualified as criminal act, it's usually qualified in more in milder form, therefore leading to more lenient criminal policy. The lack of...
Janana, we'll now have then to stop. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we did have some technical problems, but we would still, I think that it's important for us to also just go through this after the break and read the recommendations. So now, apologies for taking a little bit longer. we did have some technical
sorry,
issues.
Amina, I just need 2 sentences to finish my presentation. So I just wanted to finish with the problems relating to domestic violence and femicide, that during criminal prosecution of the cases, it's evident that institutions put formal and dominant accent on mitigating circumstances, and that the reasoning of the decisions is not satisfactory. In regards to sexualized violence, the biggest problem is proving the consent and proving the resistance that the victims of sexualized violence are actually giving to their perpetrator. I will share with you the most important recommendations on the beginning of the next session. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Anna. Sorry for the interruption. Dragi učesnici, ja se nekako evo spontano prebacila.
Dear participants, I somehow spontaneously switched to Bosnian. Anyway, we will take a break and let's see again at 5 past noon or 7 past noon. Please, let's begin at 10 past noon at the latest. Thank you for your patience. Please do not log out so that we don't have to let you into the meeting again. Just mute yourself and switch off your video. Thank you.
break is over. Hopefully you had some refreshments and you managed to, I don't know, respond to some emergency calls. We now continue with the presentation of Professor Janana Radoncic. We thought it was important to really freshen up before we hear the recommendations of the presentation, and then we continue with our program.
Samo zvuk.
Thank you, Emina. I will be brief, just a couple of minutes to present the most important recommendations. Presented the comprehensive analysis of the legislative framework of the policies and practices of functioning of the system of protection has shown many problems which are shared among the observed countries, and due to common and similar socioeconomic conditions, similar institutions, etc., there's also a lot of space for common approach, regional approach, in order to enable active exchange of the best practices among countries. And hopefully this is one big event which can serve as a platform for sharing good common practices. A set of recommendations has been articulated according to which all countries in the West Balkans and Turkey should, as a matter of priority, undertake the following: provide holistic and coordinated approach toward protecting women from all forms of violence against women, and in particular establishing clear and effective coordination between all institutional actors in the protection chain. Harmonize definition of violence against women in general, as well as different forms of violence against women. This particularly is relevant to introducing the lack of explicit consent in the definition of rape. Also, there's need to establish a centralized and integral database that would be functionally linked to all relevant actors in the protection chain. As national seminars conducted in the previous couple of months have shown, Kosovo has made certain progress there, but still there's a lot of other challenges. It's not just technically establishing the database. A lot of additional work needs to be done, but certainly this is a stimulus for all countries to intensify their efforts in that regard. There's also need to replicate the Austrian model of application of emergency protection measures, by which the perpetrator of violence is immediately and without delay removed from the joint apartment and house. We will leave proving for the phase that comes afterwards, but in certain types of domestic violence, when the risk has been evaluated, there is an urgent need to remove perpetrator and then to establish the facts of the case. Also, there's need to develop specialized mandatory and continuous training programs for all professionals in the sector of security, social protection, and justice. Ensure unhindered access to legal aid services for violence against women survivors without imposing additional restrictions based on financial situation or to request to prove the previously reported violence, etc. All countries need to advocate the development and mandatory application of uniform risk assessment forms in cases of domestic violence and intimate partnership violence for all relevant institutions, in order to anticipate further steps for protecting the survivor, preventing repetition, and preventing escalation of violence in more severe form, femicide being the most severe form. Ensure consistent financial support from state budgets for providers of specialized support services such as safe houses, SOS helpline, legal aid providers, via introduction of institute persons of trust, or in some systems known as confidants, as a person which can follow a victim or survivor of different forms of violence against women while communicating with different institutions and in different proceedings that had been initiated in regards to specific case of violence against women. Also, we advise courts to impose sentences that are commensurate to the gravity of violence against women offenses, in particular domestic violence, only exceptionally issuing sentences and punishments below the prescribed minimum, followed by detailed reasoning of such judgment and decision. Also, we would like to stimulate prosecution to collect all the necessary evidence during the investigatory phase to reduce the dependence of the investigation and criminal proceedings on survivors' testimonies. And to conclude, the final recommendation is to address all forms of violence promptly and with due diligence, including those which are usually ignored before their escalation, such as verbal abuse, psychological violence, or cyber violence against women. I would like to apologize for taking a bit longer for my presentation, but this form of work is actually additionally challenging, but hopefully it was interesting for you to hear all kinds of different conclusions and recommendations, and I will be present during the 2 days of conference in case you have any comments, suggestions, or questions for me. Thank you, and I wish you all good and productive work in the following days.
Hvala vam mnogo, bez obzira na to što...
Thank you very much. We did take a bit more time for this, but this presentation really gave us a lot of meaningful themes for the discussions that will entail in the next 2 days. Our next topic refers to the perspectives. What can we expect with respect to the institutional response during the crisis? We are now facing COVID-19 pandemic. Hopefully we will not face such situations in the future. But definitely this is a very topical issue. Dr. Yasminka Jumhur, I don't know if you remember this, but in fact we've met 20 years ago in November, and exactly 20 years ago I was a young and proud lawyer, and I met then a very patient woman who had a lot of knowledge and who was leading a process. And really, Yasminka, I have to say that I'm really happy that we have this opportunity to mark the anniversary of when we've met. Thank you very much for the very nice introduction, and thank you also for reminding us of some moments that happened a long time ago. However, that reminds us that we've grown old. But at the same time, that shows you how persistent we are. We've had over 100 participants at one point. So this shows you how persistent we all are in acting in this area. From 1992, when I first met the victims of wartime sexual violence, that marked my engagement, the start of my engagement. I started working with Medica, but I was aware that we needed to have an organization that would deal with the rights of women in a broader context. Thank you to the center, thank you to the UN Women, and thank you to all the persons who are present here today, because without your work, the activist work that you do, we would not be able to draw conclusions, we would not be able to have an assessment of the situation, we would not be able to provide recommendations or do advocacy work. Irrespective of how certain things are repetitive in our presentations and in our work, I always say repetitio est mater studiorum. So I immediately want to indicate that certain weaknesses in the protection system, when it comes to domestic violence, when it comes to gender-based violence, these weaknesses, in fact, show us that we need to make change. The weaknesses urge us to make changes. So we've finished with almost half or more than half of our work today. So this is why I've opted for the following model. We will first screen the 4 videos, and I will refer through my presentation to the 4 videos. And one suggestion to the center and to all the organizations that are participating in this conference, as well as UN Women, it really would be a great idea to use the videos for the campaign in our respective countries. These videos are very good indicator, and I think we can agree with the media outlets to use them either through the 16 days of activism or later on or long term, because real life stories are the best way to lead a campaign. Now I would like to invite the admin to play the 4 videos, one after the other, and after that I will start with my presentation.
For over 5 years, Ivan was physically and psychologically violent with his spouse Anna. Anna reported the violence to the police, and Ivan was issued a misdemeanor fine for violating public order and peace. The police took no other steps to ensure Anna's safety. Ivan continued to be violent with his spouse. Because of her disappointing experience with the police, Anna sought the help of an organization that works with survivors of domestic violence. How did this happen? How did the system fail Anna? Because the police did not follow the mandatory legal procedures for cases of domestic violence. Because the violent incident was treated as a violation of public order rather than domestic violence. Because the law stipulates a fine for officials who fail to properly report domestic violence, but this is rarely enforced. Because the survivor was not informed by the police or the Center for Social Work about the services that were available to her. Because the survivor was only provided with protection with the help of a civil society organization. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Establish and fund safe houses for domestic violence survivors in accordance with international standards. Introduce the confidants or persons of trust to provide survivors with information about their rights and legal procedures. Require mandatory training for professionals on handling cases of violence against women. Sanction professionals who mismanage cases of violence against women. Violence against women is the symptom, not the virus. The virus is gender inequality. No cure will come as long as ineffective prevention, protection, and prosecution remain. During their marriage, Mrs. Nikolic suffered repeated domestic violence at the hands of her spouse. She reported the violence to the Center for Social Work. They said it was a family dispute and conducted mediation. The violence continued. The police intervened 65 times during their marriage, but they usually suggested that Mrs. Nikolic should behave properly. Mrs. Nikolic decided to file for divorce and for custody of their 3 daughters. She also filed for a protection order on grounds of domestic violence. But Mr. Nikolic was only charged with psychological violence, which is rarely punished. 3 years later, the court rejected all criminal charges against Mr. Nikolic. He was granted custody of 2 of their 3 daughters. How did this happen? How did the system fail Mrs. Nikolic? Because the Center for Social Work classified the case as a family dispute rather than domestic violence. Because the police failed to identify Mr. Nikolic as the primary aggressor. Because the prosecutor only filed 1 criminal charge of psychological violence against Mr. Nikolic and none for physical violence. Because the children were never recognized or protected as potential victims of violence. Because the court did not consider parental alienation by Mr. Nikolic as abuse, despite clinical expertise showing otherwise. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Require mandatory training on gender sensitivity and working with survivors of violence for all professionals. Recognize psychological violence as a severe and damaging form of domestic violence. Require additional training for police officers to properly understand the psychological aspects of violence when assessing risk. follow strict procedures when responding to any allegation of domestic violence. Violence against women is the symptom, not the virus. The virus is gender inequality. No cure will come as long as ineffective prevention, protection, and prosecution remain. Anas became psychologically and physically violent with his wife, Indira, as soon as they married. After a year of insults, blackmail, and constant attempts to control her behavior, Indira initiated a divorce. Anas begged Indira to come back. He promised he would change. Indira became pregnant, but the harassment and violence persisted. Afraid for their child, Indira reported the abuse. For years, Anas used child custody visits to hurt Indira. The stress psychologically harmed their daughter. How did this happen? How did the system fail Indira? Because social workers assigned to the case rarely attended child custody visits, because nothing was done about repeated violence in front of the child, despite video evidence. Because the Center for Social Work showed bias and prejudice towards Indira. Because civil and criminal procedures took an unreasonably long time. Because the courts prioritized Anas's right to see his daughter over protecting her and Indira. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Ensure timely and coordinated actions by social workers, the police, and the judiciary. Provide gender-sensitive training for social workers to prevent harmful biases. Require mandatory training for judges and prosecutors on laws against domestic violence. Take into account all circumstances in a case, such as repeated violence in front of a child. Violence against women is the symptom, not the virus. The virus is gender inequality. No cure will come as long as ineffective prevention, protection, and prosecution remain. On her wedding night, Emine began bleeding heavily from the violent sexual abuse of her new husband. Instead of bringing her to a hospital, her husband took her to a religious leader who gave her traditional remedies. Amine's condition worsened. 3 days later, she died. Her husband, never charged with rape or domestic violence, was sentenced to just 2 years in prison. How did this happen? How did the system fail Emine? Because the prosecution charged Emine's husband with a violation of family obligations, not sexual and domestic violence. Because the lesser charge only came with a 2-year sentence. Because at the time, Kosovo's criminal code did not include a clear definition of marital rape. Because Emine's husband, acquitted in his first trial, was only found guilty 8 years after her death. How can we prevent tragedies like this? Sanction professionals who mismanage cases of violence against women. Appoint more judges specialized in domestic violence cases. Require mandatory training on gender sensitivity and case management for all professionals involved in preventing and prosecuting domestic violence. Violence against women is the symptom, not the virus. The virus is gender inequality. No cure will come as long as ineffective prevention, protection, and prosecution remain.
The form videos that you have seen come from different countries, but they show that there are no major differences in the procedures that relate to violence against women. In this presentation, my task will be to present the crises that have been caused by the pandemic, but we cannot make a clear distinction between what we have in our regular life without having the crisis. So I will refer to the protection system that we have existing in the countries of the Western Balkans and Turkey. And this is a two-day conference. So finally, I will also additionally respond to the consequences created by COVID-19. So the idea of the presentation is to raise a discussion to define possible modalities to improve the institutional response to violence against women, especially in the times of crisis. And in this specific case, it's the crisis caused by COVID pandemic. According to international standards, all signatory countries or member states must take measures to prevent and protect women. We often call this a P5 framework. First of all, it refers to protection. So we need to have urgent measures to protect the victim, especially if there are children who have been exposed to violent behavior. There must be additional protection for children. The second P is prosecution, efficient prosecution, not only within the boundaries of the prosecutor's office and the court, but also the police, as well as other involved stakeholders, especially the social work centers that receive information about violence, but often do not efficiently respond. We have some problems with interpretation. Could you please check your globe? It's Bosnian. Okay. Is everything okay with interpretation? Hopefully, yes. The third P refers to partnership with civil society, with non-governmental organizations. But when I say civil society, we should not neglect the role of the media here, especially with respect to raising awareness of the society as a whole. Participation is the fourth P. That's the participation of the victim. We cannot impose solutions with respect to protection or the measures that the competent authorities should impose. None of this can be imposed without active participation of the victim in the process. And finally, the fifth P is promotion. Promotion of human rights standard is the best way to prevent the violations of human rights. I will now refer to the experiences from practice, and we will refer to the videos, but also Janana Radončić was mentioning many of these aspects. When it comes to protection, we can refer to the Northern Macedonia video. I mean, when you compare it to other videos, she is the victim who asked for assistance of the non-governmental organization, and she did get support. So what this entails with respect to recommendations, we should have a sustainable model of protection, not having NGOs as service providers being unintegrated in the system and working separately depending on the availability of donor funds. The example from Northern Macedonia showed us how important it is to have a person of trust. If we don't have a person of trust, who will follow the victim throughout the proceedings? And this is the obligation from the Istanbul Convention. The victim will remain alone with her problems and will find it hard to manage the institutional system and also ensure the financing of safe houses. The second P, prosecution. Janana Radončić addressed this greatly. Qualification of criminal offenses by the prosecutor's office is key for efficient prosecution. And we saw that in the video from the Republic of Serbia. So it's not only the question of discerning here that domestic violence cannot be treated as misdemeanor, and a violation of public peace and order. So it is very important to link this criminal offense, and this is something that we miss in the region entirely, the measures that are imposed must be a comprising part of the criminal process and not a separate administrative or minor offense procedure. Next slide, please. Partnership with civil society. The video from Northern Macedonia shows us that better protection was provided to the victim who contacted an NGO. And as I've said, NGOs should be part of the systemic solution. In the entire region, we are having this big debate on the role of the non-governmental organizations in the protection of victims and in general in this gender aspect. This is an idea that really emerges, and I think that we need to open the discussion with our legislative bodies in the region and the human rights committees or gender commissions where they are, to try to find a way to improve this system and ensure that non-governmental organizations are a comprising part of the systemic solution. Participation is seen in video 1 from Bosnia and Herzegovina, because the video shows us that there is no free medical aid. If the woman is not insured, she cannot get legal aid, she cannot get medical aid, she does not have a right to compensation. And when we talk about compensation claims, we have a problem that there is a lack of knowledge among the lawyers as to how to exercise this right of the victim. Compensation is very important, and it's important to say that even when the criminal proceedings are being led, it is rarely the case, only maybe in cases when there was a lot of advocacy by NGOs that it happens, that the property compensation claim is actually being decided within the criminal proceedings. Usually, the victims were referred to civil proceedings, meaning that they are being put in a different process, which is unknown to them, and legal aid is limited.
It is very important to consider victims' needs and opinions when we do the risk assessment for the victims and when we develop the protection plan. Promotion. All videos indicate that the lack of knowledge and skills among professionals requires their trainings and specialization. If you make a compilation of recommendations of the UN bodies, be it on national or regional level, especially by CEDAW committee, you will see that the majority of recommendations repeat through periodical cycles, and also the UPR indicate the importance of trainings of professionals. The special focus is on training in international standards and their implementation, given the European Convention and its status in member states, except for Kosovo. This is because if the national legislation is not harmonized with international standards, then professionals, and especially judges and prosecutors, must be trained in direct implementation of international standards in view of the European court practice. So, since it's very important to consider the trainings of professionals mandatory and not on an ad hoc principle, what do we have in practice? NGOs and institutions for judicial and prosecutorial trainings organize ad hoc trainings for different groups of professionals, but we have transfers. These people change positions, and then you're constantly at the beginning. When it comes to law faculties, only a few law faculties in the region have the course on human rights, let alone subspecializing in gender-based violence. So these trainings, along with licensing, is crucial, in my opinion, especially when it comes to police officers, judges, social work centers. Licensing of social work centers is discussed from various aspects, but we must not forget the very broad mandate of social work centers. It's becoming more and more broad on a daily basis. And when it comes to citizens' rights, especially social rights, this cannot be transferred to social work centers without increasing their capacities, because their mandate is growing and the level of staff and capacities remains the same. So we have to keep this in mind, especially when it comes to social work centers. Public awareness raising. The video too from Turkey that we have seen, and that another one that we will show in the second day of the conference, tells us how much cases of transferring the responsibility to the victim we have. It's because we haven't raised public awareness of violence against women and domestic violence in general. I think these videos constitute an excellent tool that we can use in the continuation of our activities. What are the obligations of the state? That is, what instruments the state uses when it accepts international standards. The first one is to establish adequate legislation, because now, especially during the COVID, we have problems with the implementation of legislation principles. You cannot impose any measures or restrictions if this is not prescribed by the law. And this is exactly what happened to us during the lockdown. Measures were imposed by different authorities that do not have the mandate for this prescribed by the law. If we don't have adequate legislation to prevent violence against women, then it results in consequences, and the system is unable to respond adequately. Tomorrow, we will see other examples from Montenegro and Kosovo that indicate that inadequate legal framework does not lead to inadequate sanctioning and violence prevention. For example, a rape in marriage and a spectrum of criminal offenses that are related to violence against women. For all these things, it's very important to have adequate legislative framework. The proponents are crucial, the executive government branch and the ministries that are often undercapacitated. Also, the academia and practitioners should be included in this process in order to develop a finished product. Because if the executive government is unable to define such proposals, then it's good to have proper solutions through parliamentary groups that are trained in proper implementation of international standards. Also, you can have perfect legislation, but you have inefficient institutions, and the implementation of the legislation is related very much to the capacities of the institutions. So what is the lack of efficient institutions? Domestic violence reported to the police 65 times, treating the problems as family problems by the social work center, inadequate qualification of the offense by the prosecutor resulted in the acquittal of the perpetrator, and failure to identify victims as children of violence. Also, there is another video from Turkey and from Serbia that we will see tomorrow, and they show us that the inefficiency of institutions to prosecute domestic violence result in deaths of victims. We have an example from Tuzla from several years ago. Violence was reported 17 times to the police, but eventually, unfortunately, the perpetrator killed the victim. The third segment, legislation, institutions, and clear procedures. So who does what and how? This primarily includes separate actions of the institutions and their joint activities that require efficient communication and high level of coordination. Video 1 from Albania that will be shown tomorrow shows us, like all other videos, that somewhere between the institutions something is going wrong. This cannot be solved by protocols on cooperation. These things should be prescribed by the law in a national context. If there is a need for more detailed defining of the procedures, then the law says that the minister will adopt a regulation or another bylaw that will regulate the specific issue. It seems to me, after years of working on these issues, that avoiding to define clear procedures creates a limbo which enables different practices and inefficient prosecution. I tried to divide obstacles and weaknesses here. Obstacles are defined as facts that come from the outside and affect the process of prevention of domestic violence. There are weaknesses that exist within the institutions working on violence. So as we said, obstacles include inadequate legislation, and it's very difficult for us to define it regardless of the accepted international standards. The unestablished or undeveloped capacities, safe houses, and so on. NGOs are not obligated to establish such capacities. And also, no educational system which produces future professionals that will take efficient action. And also, failure to raise awareness of violence against women. If you don't do it at the early stage, we will have problems in the future. There is no awareness that the violence against women is a crime. And also, another obstacle is that we take international standards lightly. Our countries are very proud because they ratified the Istanbul Convention and CEDAW, but when the monitoring shows us that obligations are not fulfilled, there is no mechanism to react properly. On the other hand, we have problems within the institutions. No education in taking action in cases of gender-based violence, lack of sensibilization, because COVID shows us where you have sensibilized experts, they provide better response and better prevent violence. Insufficient number of women in police structures, especially among police inspectors. We keep repeating this, but only repeating can lead us to a change. A lack of awareness among professionals that violence against women is a crime and that it should be prosecuted instead of requesting the woman to report it and to file criminal referral, and the insufficient level of knowledge about international standards. Obstacles also include insufficient awareness of the role of the civil society, especially NGOs. For example, I'm an ombudsperson, and I'm so tired, not only from protecting NGOs. I'm tired of the discussions that they are international spies, that they work for large amounts of money. This lack of understanding for an activist approach, which gives adequate color to the processes, this should be changed. We need to discuss these issues. But to be honest, NGOs often have a problem because they are guided by their project possibilities, how to ensure sustainability. Also, there is no obligation to collect data on gender-based violence on a system level. Because if we establish databases, then we will have proper mechanism, and also a lack of efficient multi-sectoral approach. On the other hand, we have weaknesses, which include insufficient level of understanding of the civil society role by professionals, but changes have been made in that regard, and professionals are increasingly becoming honest partners of NGOs and vice versa. The next weakness is lack of self-initiative in establishing systemic data collection on victims. And the next one is that the institutions are focused on the abuser more while the procedure is ongoing, but when the proceeding is over, they don't continue working with the perpetrators. And the lack of efficient coordination between the institutions based on the law. And in addition to all this, on top of all this, now we are facing a crisis. There are various crises. We will not talk about them right now, but currently we are focusing on the COVID-19 pandemic. The situation in all of our countries is additionally impeded by the migrant crisis. We must not forget this aggravating factor. This crisis is still ongoing and its end is uncertain. All of us are very tense because of what is going on. So, for example, what has the crisis brought us? Ombudspersons from our countries, all of us reacted, because when you look at different websites, you see that the influence of COVID on civil rights when it comes to the freedom of expression, of assembly, and political rights, because we have elections in almost all countries in the region, economic and social and cultural rights, losing jobs, increased exposure to mobbing, labor exploitation, inefficient healthcare system, both for COVID patients and other patients, including victims of domestic violence, because in such a system, not only that you're not a priority, but you cannot receive regular service. And also the access to education and cultural content has been limited, which has affected very much the mental health in a negative way. The crisis, the COVID, resulted in the introduction of additional measures in order to prevent the pandemic. So in addition to restricting our rights during the crisis, additional measures were introduced that have been occupying and limiting us additionally. Restriction on movement for certain categories, restriction of movement for overall population during night, on the weekends, introduction of curfew, limited access to closed spaces in order to maintain social distance, and so on. So what are the consequences of all this? The police that work on prevention of crimes and on prosecution, they now have a new role. They have to supervise the implementation of these new measures. And also social work centers, they distribute packages and aid. Health workers are reassigned to COVID hospitals and outpatient departments. We are decreasing the institutional capacities through this mobilization, thereby limiting our ability to deal with the prevention of domestic violence. And finally, we have a situation that authorized persons are also infected by COVID, which creates additional difficulties in the institutional activities. So even if you are top manager, you want to do the best possible thing, you have people in isolation, you have infected people, there are no plans, there is no nothing, you have no idea what to do in order to meet all the standards. We have the changed work regime in order to reduce physical contact by working from home. This is very worrying because court hearings are not being scheduled or are being cancelled. It doesn't only apply to violence. I also talk about conflicting divorce cases. That involves issues of contacts with children and so on. All of us have to take regional action in order to prioritize this because this leaves lasting trauma on children. Failure to provide legal aid and support to victims and lack of a system which would monitor the needs of the crisis situation. What are the potential solutions for the improvement of institutional action? We cannot exclude the obligation to implement international obligations. We have to do this. We have to develop risk assessments when it comes to the system, and also individual assessments for the victims, because circumstances have changed when we make assessments now for the victims. Developing plans based on these assessments and ensuring their implementation. Trainings of authorized persons in all institutions should be obligatory. This is a long-term objective, and it's very difficult to implement it during the pandemic, but we can focus on crucial persons in this process. We have to think about mobilization of additional resources, which includes intensified use of ICT technologies. For example, this particularly applies to reporting of domestic violence. Yes, give me the ability to use the new technologies, provide me with constant assistance, social assistance. And also another question is what human resources we have. If professionals are unable to do it, let's include students. This can be a part of their practical work, students from senior years. Why wouldn't we mobilize them too? Because this would be a good experience for them as well. And also including volunteers. We have many people who would be willing to volunteer, but the system doesn't know how to use this. Also mobilization of the media in order to raise awareness. I've been insisting on this these days because this is the best channel of communication with citizens, and using the guidelines that we prepared as a framework. Thank you for your attention. I really tried to fit in the timing that I've had. I'm at your disposal for all questions, and we will continue this tomorrow. Thank you very much, Jasminka. This has been a good introduction. We will expand today's conference by 30 minutes for those of you who can stay with us for questions and discussion. I think that these recommendations are very concrete and applicable are something that we can refer to. If you have questions, you have the icon participants, and when you click on it, in the left-hand side, you have the ability to raise hand, and also you can use chat. I will ask our translators to be alarmed and to follow the chat, so you can ask questions in your mother tongues. So I'm inviting you. It's even possible on Zoom to raise hand. So now I'm giving you the floor for questions and comments. Let me just add, during the first part of today's session, Fatime Dermako wanted to say something. She's expressed the wish to contribute to the discussion. So I'm now inviting Fatime to join. If she's here, now is the time. Until then, if you don't want to take the floor, or if the connection is not so good, feel free to write down your questions in the chat. We will give you a minute or two to think about your comments and remarks, maybe the applicability of the recommendations in the system as they have been defined in quite a simple way based on long-standing experience. None of us expected what has happened this year. Hopefully we will forget it soon. So maybe we can share some experiences from the process, or maybe comment on the recommendations.
Pošto ja ne vidim, nema ruku.
I don't see any raised hands. Dina Knežević. Yes, good afternoon. I hope you can hear me. Yes, we can hear you well. Thank you for the invitation. Greetings to all participants. Thank you for the wonderful presentations. I would like to refer to the presentation by Mrs. Janana. I think that you covered all the crucial elements. I see that you nicely analyzed Montenegro and all other countries in the region. You tackled all the crucial elements. I would like to say that the Ombudsman institution in Montenegro has been analyzing court judgments during this period. When I say court judgments, I'm primarily referring to judgments of minor offense courts. So I would like to ask you and maybe other participants if something similar was done in the region, if the court judgments were analyzed and what were the conclusions. Even more so because in Montenegro and in other countries in the region, what is specific for court judgments is the lenient sanctioning policy, lenient sentences for perpetrators of domestic violence. The sanctions do not deter, but they actually stimulate. For example, the law on the protection of domestic violence in Montenegro, the maximum sanction is 150 euro for such a minor offense. And the Ombudsman institution initiated amendments to the law on the protection from domestic violence. And the Line Ministry of Justice formed a working group, and this law, that is the amendments to the law, are being prepared. Of course, this doesn't mean that the amendments to the law will change our practices, because as we know, the amendments to the legislation do not mean that the practices will be changed, because there are rooted stereotypes against women. So this was one of my questions related to the analysis of court decisions. Did you have such analysis in the region, and what were the conclusions? Thank you. Thank you, colleague Radončić.
Hvala vam, hvala za komentar I upit. I should continue in English, I suppose. So regarding monitoring of criminal and misdemeanor proceedings, I can talk with certain authority in regards to Bosnia and Herzegovina, because we have been as an organization involved in 10-year-old monitoring of criminal proceedings in cases of gender-based violence. I am familiar with different initiatives in other countries, but for example, for Serbia, someone could add if I'm wrong or if something else happened. In regards to monitoring cases of femicide, their focus was on analysis of media reports on femicide, primarily in Serbia, for example. But in Bosnia, we actually got into courts and we followed criminal proceedings. We analyzed all documentation within the criminal files. We analyzed judgments, their reasoning, which is particularly important. And regarding the problems we observed. First of all, the problem begins with the mild qualifications, as I already mentioned. In previous period in Republika Srpska, the entity of Bosnia and Herzegovina, there was a dual criminalization, or should I say dual defining of domestic violence as both criminal offense and misdemeanor, and that created discrepancies in the practice. But nevertheless, the problem is, regardless of the concrete type of the violence against women, that there is a mild qualification, there is a relatively wide ignoring the different aggravating circumstances in those cases, ignoring the fact that children were present during the violence. Children are generally not being perceived as victims of domestic violence, etc. And that would, of course, reflect on qualification, or should reflect, but it is not reflecting properly. There is a special focus on mitigating circumstances, and we actually mentioned that this on different occasions. It's absurd to perceive the family status of a perpetrator and the fact that he's father to 3 minor children, for example, as mitigating circumstance for domestic violence, etc. And we have mentioned that in our reports and analysis on gender-based violence and related criminal proceedings. And I have to say that we observed the small but nevertheless changes in the practice. So on courts, we have conducted monitoring for the last 10 years. There has been an introduction of better practices. There is a certain trend that family status, for example, is not openly being recognized as mitigating circumstance. But on different courts which were not involved in the monitoring, we can observe the findings that were the same on the courts that we are monitoring for 10 years. But for example, I'm sorry if this is confusing, I will just make it more simple. There is courts that we've been monitoring for 10 years, and there are courts that we have started monitoring in the last year. And we can observe that findings are actually shared and common, but on the courts where we have monitored for 10 years, there is a change in practice, and they are better in providing support to victims during the procedures. There is a difference in the language being used by professionals. There is different in criminal policy, etc. So monitoring is working. It is producing visible results. But of course, I would say that perhaps the biggest shortcoming is something that is in general applicable to the judiciary, and that is the lack of properly reasoned judgments. The fact is that judges are actually not using every opportunity to properly justify certain judgments, and that is the primary problem, in my opinion, because we have analyzed hundreds and hundreds of judgments in criminal proceedings of criminal courts, and you can always see the shortcomings in the entire criminal justice system in the reasoning of the judgment. So that is one of the most important aspects for judiciary as such. But of course, every stakeholder, or should I say every institution involved in the criminal response system, is actually responsible for doing its maximum according to the obligations established in the law. I will just mention one particularly worrying trend regarding sexualized violence in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where we read a couple of judgments where judges actually got themselves involved in trying to justify the rape, or should I say analyzing whether the victim has provided active resistance to the sexualized violence. It went so far as to judges claiming that once the victim is attacked, it doesn't matter if the perpetrator uses a gun or anything else, it is our primal human instinct to defend ourselves. And if the victim is not using everything that is available to her, including her own physical strength, to protect herself, then actually she didn't feel threatened, and actually perhaps there is consent to the concrete sexual act. So this is the words from judges. This is not nothing that we concluded that perhaps they meant that. No, this is exactly what the judges and defense lawyers during the criminal proceedings said. We find that extremely worrying, and it's particularly present in the courts that were not included in the monitoring previously. They're included this year, but previously not. So the point is, monitoring is working, it's producing concrete, visible results. It's taking slower steps, but nevertheless, I think we produced concrete changes in the system, and more concretely in the response of criminal justice system.
Hvala. Najljepša hvala.
Thank you very much. Just a minute. We have a message in Albanian in the chat. Does anyone else want to say something? Let me just check. I will ask the translators to translate this on the chat. I think this is just an instruction on how to raise hand. I think this is what the Albanian message says by the moderator from the Women's Rights Center. We had the opportunity to hear some recommendations directly related to management of crisis situations. If there are no further questions, reactions, or comments, and since we will continue tomorrow, we will just give you a few more pieces of information about the materials that were produced during this process, the availability of the study, which is currently being translated, and the newsletter for every country that will be available during next week. The video materials that you could see, even if you didn't understand it because it was in English, was developed in a user-friendly way so that the images are clear enough, and we hope that you will be able to use them in your work and adapt them to your needs. I will ask colleagues from the center to let me know if anyone else wants to say something. If there is no one, I would like to thank all our keynote speakers and panelists in our online panel. I would like to apologize, colleagues from Serbia and Montenegro, because of the interpretation, because we only have the Bosnian option. Let me share an anecdote with you. 2 months ago, the Zoom did not update its platform with the other languages, and we had participants from the Western Balkans, and we had English, German, Spanish, and Portuguese. And as you can assume, everybody wanted to use German. So we will try to adapt this as well. Anyway, thank you for your patience, participation, and your dedication. I hope you are in good health and that this will be the case tomorrow and later. See you tomorrow at 10 a.m. If there are any other comments or suggestions that you would like to share us tomorrow, we can do it by email, or you can prepare them and just send them in the chat at the beginning of tomorrow's session. So for those of you who are on the video, I wish you and everyone else, I wish you a pleasant day. Thank you for your patience. I know the online communication is not so simple, but tomorrow, hopefully, we will have more interaction and discussions. Thank you again, and bye.